The intention was to visit two churches which were close to the houses we were visiting on this particular day out, had we made this visit in person. Both were close to lunch stop. One was close to lunch stop and one was close to the coffee stop. And they're located close to the houses we looked at this morning on the Claylands of South Norfolk. One's in Tivitshall and one's in Fulham. Both the churches we're going to look at, which are the top left and the bottom right, are in parishes that have been split, presumably apart from larger estates in earlier times. Fulham still has two operational churches, whereas Tivitshall, only Tivitshall St Margaret is still operational as a church. And as you can see, bottom left, Tivitshall St Mary didn't quite make it. Tivitshall St Margaret is a typical Norfolk church, built of abundant local flint, as Tom was talking about this morning, with sparing use of freestone, which mainly came from across the wash from Lincolnshire or Cambridgeshire. It is remote from the village, which is scattered across the whole of the parish, with only one farm now for company. As I say, the rest of the houses are scattered across the parish. This is how Ladbroke saw the church in the 1820s as part of the 737 Norfolk church drawings he did excuse me, over that period. They're not always exactly accurate, but they are a valuable resource, particularly for assessing what changes the Victorians made. And as we can see here, the images are pretty similar. The window fenestration is slightly different, but otherwise the churches look basically the same. Typical aisleless floor plan. And the north wall is typical of many Norfolk churches, the poor relation. Lots of patched render, although at least this one still has windows, some don't. And the early 14th century doorway has been blocked as it was no longer in use after the Reformation. The south door, however, was replaced in the early 15th century with its perpendicular square label around it and decorated spandrels with many Tudor roses all around both the arch and the label. And the spandrel images are firstly of the Trinity on one side and the instruments of the Passion on the other side. The door that fills that opening is a fine plank and muntin door, which may be from the same period. There are some survivals of similar doors elsewhere in Norfolk, but this is a particularly good example. Inside, the most obvious feature is the chancel arch tympanum, which we will see in detail later. There are several very damaged bench ends excuse me, which remaining, which still appear to show the labours of the months, although some of them are more difficult to identify than others. The bench backs, as you can see, are obviously make these converted from straight benches, in that they've been applied very poorly, and in some cases they've required the removal of some of the figures in order to apply them. And they appear to be of pine, some of them, but not all. Some are of pine and some are of oak. Sorry, I'll just go back. Some of the bench ends, like this one here, have figures in relief carved on the ends. Most of them have been planed flat, as typical with most of the images, which are defaced literally. Of the screen, much of the dado is still present. Dominic did tell me about the significance of the scroll along the top of the dado, but I'm afraid it escapes me now. If anyone else knows why that particular scroll is significant, I'd be interested to know. Also note the fixing points for a nave altar along this side of the screen, both here with the notch cut out and with the fixing here too. Returning to the tympanum, this is a unique survival in Norfolk, and I've not seen many elsewhere in the country either. This displays the arms of Elizabeth I and is dated 1587. At the bottom is the Decalogue, in English as would be expected at the time. It's actually legible from inside the church too. Whether it was used as part of services or not, it's difficult to tell. But the white falcon is a symbol of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. So she was still announcing herself as Anne Boleyn's daughter. The oak boards of its construction have remained remarkably flat and are still in very good condition. The roof is arch braced and has several intricate bosses, some of which are particularly well carved, and others form just shields, which presumably were painted at the time. The other church in the other parish of Tivershaw is St Mary, and this, as it was drawn by Ladbroke in the 1820s, and as it is now. There are several local stories about why it collapsed and when it collapsed. The one most popularly given out is that it was a result of a sonic boom in 1947. But given that sonic booms must have been fairly rare then, and the fact that this church is very remote from the village, and that St Margaret's Church in the other parish is closer to a lot of the houses in this parish, it seems more likely that perhaps a tipping point was really reached in terms of requirement for maintenance or something, and the costs were too much, so it was allowed to decay. Again, typical Norfolk construction, but the interesting thing is that the east window is different from that shown on Ladbroke's drawing. Ladbroke's drawing appears to show some sort of arched transom across the middle of the window, and also the bottom part of the window being blocked, presumably for reredos or something similar. So there was still Victorian investment in this church. Moving on to Pulham Church, this is Pulham Market, which is they're both dedicated to St Mary, but this one dedicated to St Mary Magdalene. And again, this is how it was seen by Ladbroke in the 1820s. It's next to the marketplace in the centre of the village, and is still in the centre of the village now. Here, Ladbroke shows the north porch, which is similar to, but much less elaborate than the one at Pulham St Mary, which we'll see in a moment. Pulham St Mary the Virgin parish also had a chapel dedicated to St James, built in 1401, which was a guild chapel for the Hatters and Cappers Guild. It became a school in 1670 and was taken over as a community resource at the end of the 20th century, and now serves coffee. And in fact, we would have had coffee there had we been in Pulham on the day of the visit. This is close to the church of Pulham St Mary the Virgin, with its imposing 7-stage tower. It is a tower of 2 halves. The top 3 stages above the string course are of slightly different material and appear to have been built slightly later. The most important part of this church is the porch shown to the right. Again, as it was drawn by Ladbroke, a more elaborate version than its neighbour a couple of miles west of it. The church had a single south aisle, and as we will see, there have been other works to it, into its floor plan, in addition to the aisle being added. The porch is late 15th century, described by Pesner as the best in Norfolk, but possibly not as grand as the one at Clyde next to the sea. Clyde being a very rich port and presumably could support a more elaborate set of stonework. The two spandrels at St Mary's show the Annunciation. On the left is Gabriel, and on the right is a rather masculine looking Mary, although there is an odd stovepipe shaped object next to her. We're not sure if this is the thing carried by Gabriel when during the Annunciation, but wouldn't quite fit, so the carver had to make it look like a stovepipe. Outside the spandrels, the angels on the left play wind instruments, all slightly different. And on the right, they play stringed instruments, again, all slightly different, including some bowed and some plucked. In all, there are 12 image niches. It's possible they were for the apostles, because this is a theme which continues inside the church, as we will see. And there are two angels carrying one symbol, one of the Passion, and again one of the Trinity, in a similar way to the spandrels at Tivishall Church. More of the image niches and the extensive napped flint work, coursed and napped, that goes all round the porch, but not on the church itself. The stonework is fairly intricately cut too. There have been one or two churchwarden repairs to it, which rather spoil the black finish, but from some parts it's almost still completely black. The frieze at the top is also similar to the porch at Cly, and there are several fine figurines on the top of the pinnacles on the corners. Inside the church, Bodley's restoration of the 19th century is evident. It allegedly cost around £5,000, which is close to £1 million in today's money. He particularly worked on the screen and on the font cover. It can be seen here that the nave has been extended southwards, probably before the aisle was added, as the chancel is off-centre to the east wall of the nave. It appears that the font has been gilded too. Now, it's not clear as to whether this was done by Bodley or whether it was done subsequently to match the colour scheme that he put onto his cover. And the screen is the crowning glory of the church, and it is unusual in that the elaborate nature of the chancel side, of the nave side rather, is matched by the same on the chancel side of the screen. Both the decoration and all the painting and everything is all the same both sides. Note also the unusual ladder going up to the ringing floor, presumably replaced an internal ladder within the tower at some point. But here again, it can be seen that this door is in the centre of the nave wall, but not the tower arch. The tower arch is off to the northern side as well. So this is the screen where Bodley did most of his work. And as Dominic said at the time, it's just as well that Bodley did not repaint the screen dado, which appears to have some of its 15th century original figures, and indeed 2 or 3 of them still have their original facial features, which is unusual. I suppose it's possible they were painted over at the time, so protected. There is an extensive scheme of 19th century glass in the church by Burleson and Grills, but the most interesting glass, I think, are the parts reused from 15th century glass, including one figure that has a Catherine wheel for a midriff. So presumably these have been reused from all over, either this church or perhaps even coming from further afield. Looking at the two Pulham parish churches together, one has to ask whether they were in competition with each other over who could build the taller tower and who could have the most complex porch. But either way, both survive and are definitely worth a visit if you're ever in this part of Norfolk. I'm afraid that's all my notes can stretch to. Dominic would have been much more verbose about it and much more complete, I'm sure, but thank you for listening.